On today's episode, we'll be touching upon different government types, and in particular, we'll be looking at democratic governments, what they are, and how they function. He's Jordan, I'm Braden, we are the Realist Idealists, and this is Powerview. When speaking about governments, we're really speaking about who has the authority to set the rules on how we as people live our lives. There are many different ways we decide who gets to control how we govern our lives. Historically, we have had states ruled by small groups of people, whether it be wealthy elites, groups of elders, religious figureheads, and dictatorships, where a single person holds the sole authority over the people within their borders. But we also have systems where all the citizens have a say in the way society should be governed. And instead of a small group ruling them, it requires the majority to be in favor of the ruling class. This is what we know as democracies. And yes, in extreme cases, complete anarchy where there is the complete absence of government and nobody has authority over the society do exist. All these types of governing systems can be boiled down to two major types: authoritarian regimes and democratic systems of government. The term authoritarian is not the most accurate term for everything that is not a democracy. However, authoritarian regimes can be looked at as everything where a government body has total control over society. There can be slight differences from one authoritarian regime to another, like whether it's ruled by a group or an individual, or whether the authority is given through divine right, like that of an absolute monarchy, or through military might, as in a military dictatorship. However, the key to keep in mind is that in an authoritarian government, the ruling group or individual has full autonomy over the entire society. For today's episode, we want to focus on democracies, since, in comparison to authoritarian governments, democracies are a little bit more complex in terms of how they function, and because of this, the pros and cons associated with this form of government are sometimes harder to see and understand.
So then we ask ourselves, what is a democracy? Most people in the world would know what a democracy is. However, if we're going to go for a more formal definition, a democracy refers to the system of government that allows all eligible members of state, its citizens, to have a voice in their political progress, regardless of how the form of democracy functions. All democracies are based upon having say in how they wish to be governed. Inherent with democracies is the concept of freedom, which arguably represents the best and most important aspects of democracy. Since democracies are all about giving people the right to have a say in how they are governed, it is necessary for a true democracy to give people the freedom to do so. This is by far the most important part of democracies, and it is the standard that all democracies are held by. Freedom in democracy comes in a number of different forms, however. The most obvious, of course, is being the freedom to vote, and with that, the freedom to choose who you wish to represent you in government. In democracies, citizens have the freedom to speak out against the government or any issues they wish to address in society, aka the right to protest. This naturally has to be part of democracies, as all citizens have a right to have a say in how they wish to be governed, regardless if that is what the majority agrees with. This means that governments cannot cause harm to people who speak out against them, as long as those people are not causing harm themselves. Somewhat connected with the freedom to protest is the freedom of information. Now, this does not mean the government needs to release every last detail of what they are doing all the time, but it does mean that there needs to be a level of transparency, as citizens always have a voice in government. With this is the freedom of the press, and more broadly, the freedom to access different sources of information not controlled by the government.
So, as we mentioned before, there are some variations when we are talking about democracies. The first distinction is based around how we represent ourselves. So, there are two main forms of democratic representation. We have direct democracies, where We as individual citizens have to vote on every single rule and law that we place in our government. And then we have representative democracies. This is more common where we vote in an election and we vote for an individual who will represent us in government. In addition to this, we have constitutional democracies, where the foundation of governments are laid out in a single document. This document is the be all end all and is what all laws have to be based upon. We also have a newer version connected with this form of government, and that's called a monetary system. This is where there is an extension of government that is not controlled by the government, but has the authority to review and oversee if government is abiding by the rule of law. On top of the different forms of representation, it is important for us to look at how the different overarching roles of a democracy work, and in particular, looking at how the legislative and executive branches of government function. The legislative branch of government refers to the portion of government that is responsible for coming up with the laws. The executive, as you can probably guess, is responsible for implementing those laws into society. These two branches of government are important to understand the difference between, especially when trying to understand the difference between a parliamentary democracy and a presidential democratic system. When looking at a parliamentary and a presidential system, the systems of government, we are not only looking at how they separate the legislative and executive branches of government, we are also focusing on how they decide who will lead our government. In a parliamentary system, we vote for the party that best represents our views. And from that, the party with the most representation in parliament takes on the responsibility of running the government and holds the office of the prime minister. The legislative branch is made up of all the representatives in parliament. Included in this is the prime minister, who also makes up the executive branch of government, along with the cabinet ministers, who are also members of parliament, and in some cases, a senate, all make up the executive branch of government. This is in stark contrast to the presidential system, where the legislative branch is composed of all the elective representatives except for the individual who holds the office of the president. The president, who is the leader of the executive branch, is voted on separately and can represent a different ideology than that of the members of the legislative branches of government. So, now that we have a better understanding of the basics that form a democracy, I have a question for us, Jordan, that we can obviously take some time to really go over. But do you think democracies work? And by that, I mean, do they achieve what their purpose is? So, before you answer that, maybe the first place to start is looking at what their purpose is in the first place. So, we know democracies are all about giving representation or a voice within government. But why do we need that?
I think the easiest way to start answering that is looking at it almost historically in a sense of where we've come from as like, even just looking at the lens of Western civilization in the last 1,000 years. If you go back to medieval England and then into the industrial era, there's still a large, I'm trying like a bottleneck of power
Yeah, like a
in a sense.
centralization of power. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Centralization of power. And I guess
Within a small group as well,
yeah,
right?
a small,
Yeah.
like mostly monarchical systems where it's either held within a family or like through like certain members of a church and like one ruler.
Yeah. Yep.
And then it kind of from there wasn't much say in how the commoners were going to go about their day from the top down. Or sorry, yeah, from the bottom up. Sorry, it was all top
Yeah.
down.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, got dizzy. And then, but as we go through time and we come to, because a lot of people like to look at the French Revolution as the point where people decided to say, no more, we have to have a say in how government rules us. They're for the majority of people. And it's really from that point we start seeing as a necessity that people should have a say. The majority of people should have a say in how they're going to be represented. The core of the idea is definitely become it was born out of practicality,
Hmm.
out of systems of governance like feudalism and authoritarian dictatorships and just absolute monarchies. In certain cases in Europe, we've also had religious monarchies, and in the Middle East, I guess too. But yeah, in both cases, where it's
Hmm.
yeah, states are ruled by very few, and the majority can't go about their lives or only go about their lives based on how those few people want them to live it. So, out of a necessity over time, democracies were born as the way to give everybody in society a small form of representation in how their system functions.
Yeah.
Now, to get to the larger question, is what you asked me, what we're going to look at is what is their purpose. So, before we answer that, I'm going to start looking again at their purpose.
Hmm.
And do they serve their purpose? And that is where it gets a little bit more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah, and
But
I mean
there's
we can there's so much of that, and we'll obviously
yes,
carry
because
on to.
you can say and you can look at it with a broad brush. And yes, we all, and I shouldn't say we all, but in the Western world, or at least in the developed world, we all have the ability to go vote, whether it's
Mhm.
here or South Korea or Japan. If you're 18 and you're paying taxes, you can vote. So, and I think in most cases too, you don't even have to pay taxes to vote. So,
No, technically not, because I mean, if you
yeah,
didn't
you
make
just
any
have to be a
income,
citizen,
right? Yeah.
right? So, and as we say, that was the basic is giving citizens representation.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel like kind of going off of what you originally were talking about there from that historical perspective. Um, I feel like a lot of governments or societies just got tired of having revolutions, right? It's that
Yes,
idea that
yes,
an authoritarian type of regime or government, right? Your monarchies, your dictatorships,
yes,
whatever it may be.
absolutes, whatever.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah, absolute governments. Um, Inevitably, they found a time where you you had the citizens of your country, your state, wanting to have a little bit more say, which I think is pretty obvious that that would be a normal case. That if you had a choice, we all want to have a say in how our lives are run.
yeah,
And then democracies kind of have come out of that idea that it's easier to just give people a voice rather than have an authoritative figure decide what's best for everyone, right?
everyone. Yeah,
Because it's always going to have someone getting upset about it. But in a democracy, you still have someone getting upset about it potentially,
yeah.
but there's some authority behind the idea of, well, at the end of the day, we all got to choose, right?
And I think that's why people always look back to the French Revolution is like that. It's like, oh, well, they went through three monarchies in like 10 years.
Yeah,
And every single one of them ended in bloodshed. It's
yeah,
like, how do we end this cycle of redundancy? Because by
exactly.
that point in European history, at least, and you could even argue most
I
of
think
even the
around
Far
the
East
world, yeah.
runs on
Yep.
have always run on a monarchical system.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's a fair to say besides really probably besides parts of North America, right? Like
Yeah, because we're such
and
a
like
new developed
yeah,
part
like
of
the
the
new
world. Yeah,
world
yeah,
areas of the world. Those are probably the only places that weren't, but you can't really even say that necessarily about like a South America
yeah.
even.
Because
It
Brazil's had
really is limited.
kings. Yeah,
Yeah.
Chile's had kings.
Yeah. It's like your Canada, your United States,
I think
your
Mexico's had an emperor at
Australias.
one
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
because they were
Yeah.
part
Well,
of
there you go.
France. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right. So it is crazy to think of it like that, but that kind of gives you a bit of an understanding of why you even have a democracy in the first place, right?
first
That
place. Yeah,
need
where
to.
the idea and the core of it comes from.
Mhm, precisely. So, um, kind of with democracies, shifting gears slightly. Now that we have a bit of sense of why we have a democracy, um, we're going to look a little deeper into democracies as a
Yes,
whole.
and
So,
I think. Oh,
oh
sorry. Go ahead.
no, no, you have something.
Actually, because I was because just to answer, like, do they achieve their purpose? And I
Yep.
think to look at it in a modern, we need to look at it mostly in a modern context because what we were just saying
Yes.
is there's so many factors, and I think one of the biggest ones is individualism because that is really in the last, I guess 100 years is really like the idea of the individual is the driving machine of like what makes America great and like what made the West great or like strong in the beginning of the 20th century in that sense. But it's also how can the reinforcement of individual become a double-edged sword to the democratic process is really what I'd like to point out. Because
Okay.
individual, of course, is the idea that it's okay to be yourself, and the goal behind individualism was to get societies to a place where they can be united while accepting that everyone is unique in their own way. And obviously, this is great. This is a thing society. It's a great thing for societies to be more inclusive. However, in the promotion of individualism as a way to unite people, we've also seen it cause a divide because we've reinforced the idea of individualism so much to the point that it's the needs of the few outweigh the needs of the many in our society at the moment, instead of the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Like, sorry for crappy quote. I couldn't think of a better one. But that's where we've reinforced the idea of like, well, yeah, Jeff Bezos has made $140 billion in 28 months, and there are people that are like, yeah, he's earned every penny of that, and it's like, well, shouldn't someone like that be taxed? And that's still obviously a bigger question for later, but it's one of those things where we've cemented individuals to the point where people support the accusation of so much wealth to be hoarded that it's okay. Like,
Yeah, and I think even kind of connected with that, because obviously for from a democratic standpoint, economics is uh, connected, but it is like you had mentioned, a whole other
yeah,
bag to
yeah,
go down and
yeah, it's a
and
whole different
unpack. But
can of worms.
um, the idea that in a democracy they're promoting this idea of freedom, right? And this idea of choice. So
Yeah,
that translates to just about every aspect of society, right? What do you like? How do you want to act in life, right? What do you want to do for work? What are the clothes you like? What do you
your
like to
social
eat?
activities, yeah,
Yeah, your social activities, your preferences, all those things. Um, it's the freedom to be able to choose those things. And I think you were already touching upon this, but the way that that affects democracies is that in a democracy, we're trying to have a situation where the closest thing to a majority opinion on something is the way that society is going to function, right? The
yeah,
majority of us think it's wrong to kill someone. So we've deemed it that in our laws, that is the way that we're going to live society. There may be some people out there that feel otherwise, but they are the minority, and therefore that decision is not weighted the same as the majority, right?
majorities, yeah,
And that individualism aspect that you were talking about, it translates to just about every aspect of society. And so when you're trying to have a democracy in how you decide on a given law, right? And we see it all the time. Uh, Not to get into this, but the conversation around abortion,
I was
right?
just, yeah,
Yeah,
you took the words out of my mouth.
yeah.
Yeah, I was like,
I
I don't want
think
to get
there's,
into it, but it's a great example.
yeah, yeah. I don't think that there is a country in this world that doesn't struggle with that conversation,
Yeah, yeah, every
because
first
there's a
world
lot.
country, yeah,
Yeah, there's a lot of differing views on how we approach that, and that individualism aspect makes it very difficult for us all to kind of come on the same page,
come
and
to a
that can be
consensus.
translated to just about, yeah, consensus, correct, right? Like and that can be translated to just about every topic that we talk about, right? It doesn't have to be something as polarizing as abortion, but
Portion.
like you
Yeah,
mentioned taxes, you
it can come down to a
mentioned,
simple yes or no with a vote. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, should
yeah,
we pay for health care, all
and you
those
can
kind of
still
things.
have a million different opinions on
Exactly.
top of that.
Yeah. And I think kind of going off of that, right? And I don't know if you want to kind of take it away with this, but I think that's where the importance of education kind of comes into play,
Yeah.
right? Like because it's
Yes.
that idea, if we're all individuals, but yet if we have a same understandanding, I might individually still come to that same conclusion
Inclusion. Yeah.
potentially. But yeah, I don't know if you
Well,
want to kind of,
to your point is, you and I were able to vote when we turned 18, And I can safely say that I didn't have a full understanding of how our political system worked until maybe after maybe, I don't know, second round of exams in second year of university, where it's like, okay, now this is all kind of making sense to me.
Yeah.
But even then, it was still kind of like, I'm like, I hope I got this right.
That's a very like fair point in terms of like the actual system, right?
Yeah, because there's still times I'm like, I'm pretty sure like I nailed that paper, but there's parts of it where I'm like, oh, don't drop all my grades because of that one time, like one
Yeah.
part. Like,
Well, that's actually a really interesting point in the sense of I don't know about you, but if I think back to my high school career, I don't know if there was a lot of times where we really kind of talked about how
yeah,
our electoral systems and how our governments function, right?
I
And I
had
think that
maybe
that can be
two. Yeah, like I'm trying to
that would
think of like two teachers that brushed on it, but
yeah,
like
probably.
when you think about how intricate the system is,
Mhm.
I think
100%.
yeah, we're not exposed to the sensitivity of that at like a young enough age to realize it by the time we're able to make those decisions and therein for turn affect society
Yeah.
with those decisions because it's we happened here I guess when Trudeau won his majority, like highest voter turnout for youth ever, and one of the platforms he was running on was to legalize pot.
Yeah, legalize cannabis, yeah.
And if I was 18 at the time, yeah, I would have been. That would have been the main reason I would have been standing in a voting line. Probably,
Yeah.
like to be honest, but
Yeah,
I
it's the
yeah,
simple
wish I was
candy that
18. But nah, I can't even lie. Yeah, we can't
uh,
pretend.
yeah. But it's a good point that there's two kind of sides I think to education, right? There is one, do you understand the system and how that functions? So I think for a lot of us, we don't necessarily, and even those who do, I think it really comes down to what types of courses or things you are choosing to learn about, right?
Learn
So
about yeah,
you may have taken, like, I'm sure, knowing what I took in high school, that I probably did have some courses that talked about um, our election systems and
yes,
how
yeah. I
Canadian
remember
politics.
very yeah.
Yeah. But I know I have tons of friends that would never have had a single conversation about that through their entire high school career.
Mhm.
And going further, right? University and
Yeah.
like any kind of post secondary education. So there is that side of things that hopefully after the end of this episode, you'll have a better idea of how democracies, just as a whole, maybe not necessarily specifically the
S
Canadian democracy,
yeah, specific
um,
types, yeah.
yeah, but as a whole, how democracies work. And then there's the other kind of flip side of education that really comes down to, um, and I would make the argument that may even have a bigger impact on democracies as a whole, is how do we educate societies in general on topics, right? So we had
Mhm.
already talked about things like taxes. We had talked about things like abortion. We've talked about things like healthcare, right? Just to name like a few things that I know a lot of people battle and have lots of conversations and dialogue on. But how we approach educating society, and if we even educate society on these things, plays a huge role on how democracies function, right? That
Yeah.
idea that if we don't understand, like, let's say, tax laws, right? It's hard for people to vote on those things if we don't truly understand it. And if they don't truly understand it, you also leave the room for manipulation, right?
Yeah, and that kinda comes back up to what I was mentioning earlier was another part of that is when we started taking those courses in post-secondary, the first thing I realized is, wow, I don't know much about my governance system. I'm learning about it now.
It's so fair, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is that kind of blew me away. I was like, "I thought I knew this stuff,
Yeah.
but I didn't." I guess I didn't.
It, and I feel like that's like both a interesting but also a scary point in some ways, because one, we were lucky. I guess lucky might not be always the term, but we chose to take courses that focused on those things. But you had already
Yeah.
mentioned, for instance, when you turn 18 now, obviously it depends on when an election happens, right? But to think that you can go through all of high school, and that's pretty much when you turn 18, right?
Yeah.
Um,
By the end of
or
it, yeah.
once you graduate high school, you're that following school year, you're turning 18. So that's potentially your first election that you may be a part of, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that you yourself said it wasn't until second year, aka you were
Yeah, I would if I
19,
could go
20
back
years old.
now, yeah, I'd tell you that don't let 18-year-old Jordan vote. He doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah,
Sit him
right?
down and have a talk with him.
Yeah. Yeah, right? And that kind
He's
of, I
full
guess,
of vim
comes
and
back.
vinegar. Yeah.
Yeah, comes back to that individualism stuff that you were talking about earlier, in that as an individual, you could choose not to learn about these things.
Yes.
But yet, as an individual, you also have the right to vote.
And that's,
Um,
I think, too, what you were trying to get to is that the education system doesn't teach you to, I don't want to say it, but I'm going to say it's critically think.
yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. I know that we're not going to delve
Yeah,
too
I don't
deep
want to
on
get
that
too
right
deep
now,
into it,
but
but in a sense where we go to school from grade 6 years old to about 18, and you're taught to read out of a book and then put those answers onto a test.
mhm,
And
yeah,
that is if you can regurgitate that information correctly, you've done good.
yeah. And then it goes a step further, like we already talked. If you were never given that book in the first place to regurgitate on a test,
Then
you
you're
really
missing
have
out on,
nothing. Yeah,
yeah,
to go off of.
on
Yeah.
that whole subject. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is those two aspects of individualism and education are kind of make it or break it when it comes to a democracy, right?
Yeah.
And I think you hit like really great points, like the idea of critical thinking when it comes to education, this desire to choose something for yourself rather than for the greater collective, which obviously in a democracy, you're looking at the collective. But
Yes. Yeah.
it's very counterintuitive to this idea of human rights and freedom and um, individualism that kind of come out of democracies kind of naturally, right?
How it
The
all kind of,
ability to choose.
yeah,
Yeah,
brews
they
together into this
they
confusion soup.
they kind of they kind of in a way conflict with each other,
Mhm.
right? It's hard to be like group mentality, but yet we're also going to like think individually.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think it's so important to understand those two aspects of it, and in particular, we see that when we look at elections, right? So,
Yeah.
uh, obviously, for democracies, pretty much universally around the world today, and the real reason for that is there's just way too many of us. But
Yeah.
the majority of democracies, if not all democracies, I apologize if there are some that still exist out there, but all of our democracies are representative democracies, meaning that we vote in an election, someone is running
And
representing
then
a certain political ideology or
they
party
sit
or
in a
something like that.
parliament or, yeah, or a
Yeah,
senate.
or
Yeah.
whatever it may be, some type of legislative assembly, and that those representatives are who are going to make our laws, right? So they are the ones who are our voice within government. So in those elections, right? I kind of just mentioned it. We tend to have those representatives. Um, those representatives represent a ideology, right? So you might have someone that's a little bit more conservative, you have someone that's a little bit more liberal,
Yeah.
and in some cases, like in Canada and the United States, they're also connected with a political party that represents those ideologies, right?
Green
In
Party or
places
the,
like
yeah.
Israel, they're not necessarily connected to a party, and in fact, they aren't connected to a party.
Yeah.
They're individuals that kind of lump together, but
Together. Yeah.
not a party. Um, in an election, and we both can talk about this, right? Democracies require you to vote, right? And the way to kind of get those votes, and I think anyone who has gone through high school and had a student council in their high school
Yeah. Everybody remembers
probably
those.
already knows how this kind of goes, right? So, um, your goal as a politician, who those are the people who are representatives, And we kind of talked about this in a previous episode around governance versus politics. If you
Yeah.
haven't watched that or listened to that yet, definitely go and do that. But in that episode, we were talking about this idea that politicians, who are the people that actually make up government, are really trying to get your vote so that they can get the job of being your representative.
Representative. Yes.
In order to do that, you sometimes are saying the things that people want to hear rather than the things that you maybe think uh, people need to hear, right? Um, it's that idea, and not to go into too much philosophy, but Socrates talks about it a lot. Where um, are you going to listen to a doctor, or are you going to listen to a candy maker, right?
Yeah.
Where like if the candy maker can spin it and be like, oh, like look at all these nice things that I have to offer, right? These sweets and all that stuff, as opposed to the doctor is going to say maybe you want to limit those things because even though they are really good and yummy, they're
Great
really
for you.
bad for your health,
Yeah.
right? Well, I don't want to listen to the doctor in those moments. So
I
give
don't
me
want to
the
eat nachos.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Give me the sweets of life, right?
Yeah.
Um whatever that may be, right? So it's dealing with that conflicting narrative where we have politicians who are supposed to represent us and represent us to the best of their abilities, but we also have a situation where going to try to tell us whatever we want to hear, which inevitably is going to cause the system to have some issues, right?
Yeah.
And not only that, but the integrity of those people that are representing us can sometimes come into question. And I'm not saying that this is universal, but um, if if I am that sweet maker, right, that idea of like I'm going to just tell you what you want to hear, I'm also going to flip flop the moment that something else comes up
Comes up.
that'll motivate me to be like, okay, let me talk to you about these things. This is where my perspective lies because that's what the majority or the loudest portion of society is
Society is
kind of
calling
calling
for.
for.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Um, so and then because of that like kind of wishy-washy flip-flopping, that's when and I don't know if you even want to take this or maybe this already kind of says it, but um that's where the over politicizing of ideas happens, right? Because
Yes. Yes.
and I kind of talked about it with that idea of the candy maker versus the doctor. The candy maker can make it sound like
Well,
candy is great,
I was
but
gonna
yeah,
say we can
go
even
from there.
we can even go back. We did kind of mention it earlier. Is the issue of abortion,
Yeah,
and it. I didn't want to
that's
eat
a
that.
heavy topic for you to pick for this. Tread
Yeah.
lightly, sir. Tread
Yeah.
lightly.
But yeah, there's it's simple to over politicize even like little things, right?
Yes.
Like you
And I
had
think
like
oh
even like
sorry.
go like it's this is a while ago, but like the whole Monica Lewinsky thing, it's like they spent so much public time and money focusing on that, and I'm like, that has nothing to do with governance. Like,
But
why this is that's a
great
private
point.
affair. That's between him, his family, and the divorce lawyer. I don't want
Yeah.
to. I
Yeah.
don't want to know. Really,
Yeah.
Like,
No,
don't
it's
want
a
to know what
great point.
Billy's doing Saturday mornings on his free time. He's he's still an individual too.
It's a great point. It's that idea that excuse me,
No, no, no worries.
that you as a person may be judged um rather than focusing on what what are you trying to implement into society,
Society,
right?
yeah,
um like judging you based off of things that may not matter, right? Or judging, more importantly, I think the appearance of how something sounds or how something looks,
comes
right?
across, yeah,
So if it's that situation, right? Or if it's um everything can be politicized, right? Going to war, right? If we make it sound like, oh, we're going to go to war because we want oil or some other resources, or we politicize it and make it sound like we're protecting freedom and democracy and all those things, right? We've seen that
yeah.
many times throughout history through multiple different types of, of nations fall under that same kind of
Yep, the
uh,
rise, fall, and
method.
rebirth. Yeah,
Yeah, right. So when you can politicize everything and you have politicians that are the ones that are our representatives, well, inevitably, everything is going to be over politicized. Everything is going to be a little bit more wishy washy in that sense. And you don't really get a government that is clinical about what may be the best result for you, right? I don't want to
Correct.
get too much into it, but obviously in the beginning, especially in parts of Canada, I think that this would be the same for lots of parts of the world. When it came to COVID, right?
Yes.
Initially, we made some decisions based off of, you could say some things about around safety, but even within that, they kind of tweaked it and were like,
Because the
"Oh,
science
like don't
wasn't
wear
in
a
yet.
mask
Yeah.
because we don't have enough masks over here," or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I know for in Ontario, that's where Jordan and I are from. Um, we had a situation where we went into a lockdown. It wasn't so much that the numbers got that much better, but at the end of the day, the economy kind of came first, right? So
Yeah.
the politicizing of something that was a health and safety issue ended up being that, well, economically we need to figure out another way to just live with this, right? And we also live in the country who, or
We've
in the province as well, who's had some of the longest lockdowns
Now
in
we've
the
had,
entire
yeah,
world.
because of that, we had
Yes.
like 3 more lockdowns, which is
Yeah,
just, yeah, because
because
they couldn't
because
make up their
we
mind.
do something that may seem right, and then we change it afterwards because, okay, something over here is not going so well, so we'll reverse that, and then we flip flop back and forth,
Yeah.
and you can see that for just about any kind of decision that's made. And I know that COVID is a very politicized issue, so we're not going to get too much into that, but you can see how things
Easily,
of that
yeah.
nature can easily, yeah, exactly, go down that road. Um, so yeah, elections are highly complex and they only get worse when you look at things like ridings. And so what those are
We have
because we
those
are
here.
represent
Yeah.
pardon me?
I was like, "We have those here." Yeah.
Yeah. So any I could be oh sorry, not any. Most systems that are representative democracies, um not 100%, and I'm going to explain why. But a lot of representative democracies have things called ridings, which are essentially like a border that everyone that lives in that area votes for a certain candidate,
I think they have
right?
counties in the US, right? Or that's how it's
Yeah.
done, I
So
think, yeah.
so they yeah, insert your wording for it, right?
Yeah.
Uh, but the idea of a riding is a representative border. So it could be
Area,
representative of a
yeah.
county, it could be a region, maybe the
Toronto
region
has,
of
like,
Durham.
30
Yeah,
ridings, yeah,
yeah,
because it's
exactly.
such a big area, yeah.
And that's exactly it. It tends to be based around population. So a prime example, right? How you just said there, Toronto has multiple ridings
Yeah,
because it's the largest city in Canada. It has tons of different people.
a
So
bunch of
the different
districts, yeah.
neighborhoods make up different ridings.
Yeah.
Um, and each riding has a representative that you have
Sits
to
in.
vote or can vote for in that riding, right? Um, the way that system works, so these are all kind of systems of how we choose our representatives. There's two main versions of this. So in the cases where you have ridings, we have a system called first past the post, right? This is what we have in Canada. um, this is a system that says whoever gets the majority of ridings, aka if one riding votes liberal, right, then the liberal representative of that riding is the one who gets to have a seat in the House of Commons, our parliament. um, it is not that the majority of people in Canada as a whole have to vote for a certain party for that party to be elected. In that case, it would be what's known as proportional representation. And now that's the idea of winning the popular vote. So in a proportional representation society, you don't have any ridings. You just vote for a party that represents your values. And let's say majority of the country is conservative. Well, it wouldn't matter how the ridings are broken down. It would just be that, hey, a majority of the people want a conservative government, then it's a conservative government that wins, or vice versa if
Yep.
it's some other kind of party. um There's obviously some pros and cons to both. Some people feel that proportional representation, at the end of the day, when you kind of look
Would
back to democracies and this idea of people getting a voice, um, that's kind of pretty integral, right? We've
yeah,
talked about this in the past with the Green Party. I
yeah,
think you and I think there's some value to some of the things that the Green Party has to
but
say.
they don't
Um,
exist in
yeah,
like
but
most writings, yeah,
yeah,
because of
they
this
don't
way.
exist. That's yeah, great. Do you want to even take that away from go from there?
Yeah, well, just because it's the way first past the post is represented. Like you don't even have like is it the fourth largest party in Canada? The Bloc Quebecois. Like you only Quebec can vote for the Bloc.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
you can be someone in Quebec, move to Alberta, and you no longer you can't vote for your party anymore.
hmm,
Which,
yeah.
not to say that they're the greatest party of all time or anything, but it's one of those things where
Yeah, they represent a certain narrative, right?
yes, yeah,
Um, no different than a party like the Green Party or
Green
something
Party,
like
yeah,
that. But in a first past the post system, often a lot of us view some of the more fringe parties, if I can dare I say that. But
Just
the fringe parties, like your green parties and stuff like that, if you vote for them, often it is considered like a throwaway vote because in a lot of ridings, you won't have a majority of people wanting a very minor political party to be running
party,
all of Canada, right?
yeah,
But you may still want, as an individual, those views to be represented in your democracy, right? Um,
yeah,
Jordan and I, again, not to hate on on the Green Party or the Bloc Québécois or the People's Party of Canada or something like that, but we don't necessarily always feel that they would have enough to run an entire country, right? Their views
yeah,
are very singular in nature, and I think we're not uh, in the minority in that view, right? Most people in Canada lean towards the Conservatives, the Liberals, and the NDP,
yeah.
the
Those
New
are the
Democrat
three, yeah,
Party.
the
Yes,
trio, yeah,
yeah, they are our main ones. No different than if you were looking in the United States.
yeah, the
You have
Democrats and the
Democrats and
Republicans, yeah,
Republicans. Of course, you have independents, and of course, you have some minor parties,
yeah,
right? Like uh, whatever the Cannabis Party of America or some random things like that where you've
yeah,
created a party. But oftentimes you don't see those people get elected because we kind of link ourselves to a party that makes a little bit more of a catch-all um, in terms of perspective in terms
yeah,
of running a government, right?
yeah, and that's where you get it narrowed down to those three.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
that's why you'll only really see those three coming up in the elections over and over and over again. The only
Yeah.
reason the bloc keeps coming back up is because Quebec's the second largest province in the country. So,
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's a great point in the sense of you also will see the block because they are centralized within a
Quebec.
specific area that represents that party. Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Like the
They're
Bloc
not spread
Québécois
out. Yeah.
is about Quebec interests. It's about French interests. Well,
Yeah.
typically, I'm not saying that obviously there's French people all across this nation, but um, there are the majority of people who have French as a first language or have the values of the Bloc Québécois tend to be in Quebec.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, and so you will have them get represented in their ridings.
Writings. Yeah.
Um, and that's in contrast to something like the Green Party, who is our environmental party. That, yeah, sure, I think there's lots of people around this country that would vote for someone who cares about the environment,
Yeah.
especially in today's society. Uh, but
We've even seen surges of votes for them in certain places.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
100%. They I'm not saying that they don't have seats
But
in
yeah,
parliament,
it's
but
hard for them to
the
get a
the
seat.
the yeah, the political ideology of that is more decentralized, right? There isn't a province in Canada that is the Green Party. I guess you could maybe
Yeah,
say
there's no.
BC
Yeah,
is
we
the
don't have a
closest
green.
thing to
Yeah,
that,
they'd be
or
probably the closest, and even then,
yeah,
still even
yeah,
hard to
even
peg
then,
them as
it's
NDP.
yeah, yeah, right. And so as you can see from all of our rambles here, that there are some distinct differences, of course, with first past the post versus proportional representation.
Representation. Yeah.
Um, but in particular, that there are different outcomes that can come out of that, right? In
Yeah.
Canada right now, we have a minority liberal government. I'm pretty sure if you looked at the seats in the last election, if it was a proportional representation government or election,
Election. Yeah.
um, I I I apologize if this is incorrect. Last time I checked, it could have been. We've had a few elections recently, but I believe that it actually would have been a conservative
The last election, I think, would
minority
have. Yeah.
government. Yeah, I believe that the conservatives actually would have had enough seats to have a minority government based off of the amount of people that voted conservative in the
Yeah.
entire country,
But they
right?
didn't win the most amount of ridings.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And that obviously is going to affect things, especially if you were someone who voted conservative, right? You might feel cheated. Um, and then kind of there's another layer to it, that how are those ridings created, right? We
Yeah.
see this all the time. It's talked about a lot if you follow American politics in particular. But um, oh my goodness, I was going to say gentrification. That's not what I need. Um, Oh my gosh, I blanked. I apologize, everyone.
No,
um,
no, no worries.
it's it'll come to me eventually, but it's the term, and then you guys will all be like, "It's this." Um, it's the term where you are kind of re redividing borders for a political riding, right? Like or sorry, an electoral riding, um, based upon certain factors. So you may choose
Population. Yeah.
to like there are places where on one side of a street they have to vote for a different representative person in
Then they
their
do. Yeah.
riding than the other side of the street. Literally on the same street, but it's like across the street neighbor,
There's
right?
a good example right here where if you're
Yeah.
coming up Winston Churchill, there's a set of lights, and you make a left, you're in Oakville, you make a right, you're in Mississauga. It's just,
Okay, yeah.
and like one side that is residential, the other side's industrial, but there's still more residential past that. But you're like, yep, that's, you can see your neighbors and you're voting in completely different ridings.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, I was trying to see if I could find find
Oh, the term. Yeah,
the
yeah.
term. Ah, I can't find it. It's okay. Nevertheless, I'll
It'll
I'll add
come.
it in
It'll
at some
come as we're
point.
about to be done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. As we're about to end this, um, but yeah, so it's that there's a tool of governments and the people who create those electoral ridings where you can make it so that maybe in a given area a certain political ideology would be the majority, right? Let's say it's
Yeah.
conservative, right? But you can kind of parcel up that geographical area so that they are lumped in with other people that have more liberal views or more whatever, right?
Centered or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so you essentially have it where you're not going to necessarily get an accurate representation, right? So for some of these in our last election, I'm sure that there's some people that maybe would look at things and say, "Oh, that the people of our neighborhood would have voted liberal, let's say, but because we've parceled up the way that the borders are and the boundaries for our electoral riding,
Yeah.
that the majority of people end up being conservative, right?
Yeah. Just
Um,
with the way it's
yeah, and
the
it's not
borders. Yeah.
necessarily representative of the neighborhood. It's representative of I'm also voting with people that are way down the road or like a
Yeah.
few blocks that way and you're voting with a few with people that are a few blocks that way,
That way.
and
Yeah.
that side of the street is the wealthier neighborhoods and this side of the street
I was going to say
are
that's a
lower
good example
income.
because they'll
And
give you when you have to go, like
yeah.
you get so many places you can actually go vote to.
Yep.
And it's like you have these 3 or 4 options. That's it, and you're like, oh, but they're all so like. There's one over there. It's like, no, you can't vote at that one. I was like,
Yeah,
ah,
this specific one is your place to vote.
the
Yeah.
gas is $1.60.
Yeah, so many different little things. But yeah, nevertheless, um though those two types of systems when it comes to electing our officials um play a huge role in what the outcome will be, right? They both have pros and cons. They both have ways to manipulate certain things. Like proportional representation isn't always the greatest because you can have, like for instance, in the United States, if they always had proportional representation, which they don't, but if they did, you
uh,
wouldn't really ever see a Republican government.
no, because it
Um,
would always be New York and California
Yeah, the amount of people that
swaying the votes.
are
Yeah,
exactly the
there's just so
proportion
many
of
more
people that are
people.
Democrat in their ideologies
Or
uh,
yeah, like the
is the
majority.
vast majority of people. But
Yeah,
the Electoral College kind of tweaks some things, and I know that
yeah,
um, for those who are, if we have American listeners, um, there are some kind of nuances with your system in terms of the Electoral College and stuff like that. But you do still subscribe to that same idea where there are political ridings. You the votes are tallied based off of that riding, and then
yeah.
that riding, whatever they voted for, is representative for the political party type of thing that won the majority in that
One
riding,
majority.
and
Yeah,
then
yeah, I know.
you count up all those ridings, and that's how you
That's how you get your total.
decide
Yeah,
how many congressmen or senators and
for each.
stuff of
Yeah,
that nature are elected into office. So, needless to say, I think there's a lot of different elements that kind of come into that, and in particular, I think one of the bigger elements, if Jordan, you want to take this one,
yeah.
lobbying,
Oh
right?
yeah. Oh yeah.
We've already seen how the voting system can just be tweaked and manipulated through the politicizing of things, and just how the actual system itself
Yeah.
works for elections. But we're getting into a little bit of the human aspect of it. So with lobbying, do you mind taking away with
Yeah.
that?
So there's a wide variety of lobbying groups, and maybe we'll just look at it like as a sense of these are individual interest groups that approach government. I shouldn't say like individuals, but either like in our case, it approach like the representative of a party, and um, we will give you like if do this for us, we'll give you funding for your next campaign. Certain degree, you get some money for your to run your campaign, make some commercials, and it can be good, it can be bad, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, we don't. Like, it's usually left up to morality, which we all know there's lots of loopholes in that in our system and just in the world in general. But where you have the interests of powerful companies and big corporations that persuade governments to their cause. So we know a lot of people are very well aware that the energy sector and the fossil fuel sector they have very big lobbyists in the United States, and they
I
have
think the fair thing would be everywhere.
well,
Any
yeah,
like
I shouldn't
in
say yeah, I shouldn't say
Canada,
the United
yeah,
States. They're
yeah,
everywhere.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but
Yeah,
yeah, they're
no,
yeah.
sorry, I cut you off, but yeah,
No, no, no.
just to be fair to it, we have the energy industry is the second largest industry in Canada, so
Yeah,
you can
they're
best believe,
definitely yeah.
yeah,
Well, you could argue almost every developed country between them, pharmaceutical companies. You also have like environmental lobbyists as well,
yeah. Because I
which
was gonna
some of them,
say, lobbying really, to be fair to it, it refers to interest groups that are putting their influence or their dollars, like whatever
yes,
it may be, however their influence is, hard and soft power,
into
into trying to convince government to
to
support
enact,
their cause, right?
yeah,
And
or
that
to
could be
enact laws
things,
to support their cause.
yeah,
Yeah,
right? Like back in the day, the tobacco industry was huge into lobbying. So
yeah,
regulations on tobacco and things like that
yeah,
weren't. in place. Now those things have changed over time because the lobbying groups that are against like secondhand smoke and things like that
Yeah, are
have
now more
really
powerful than the
y-
smoking lobbyists.
yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So to your original point, there are pros and cons on it. Like it's not all that every lobbying group, right? You might have uh, the teachers federation, right? Like
Yeah,
okay, like your education lobbying
teachers
groups, right?
union or whatever
Yeah,
here.
there's
Yeah,
some positives out of that. I think that you can make some arguments that at times
like
that
everything in the system, it's not
yeah,
perfect.
yeah,
Yeah, far from it.
exactly,
Yeah,
right.
and then a big thing too is like public opinion doesn't have any sway on it. It all, well, at least
Well,
for the most part, it doesn't. But
yeah,
money's the motivating factor in a place like the states, and even here.
I think wherever you see um, lobbying, money plays a huge part of it, right? Because
Yeah,
it takes money to do even
we could
soft
even
power
argue
type of
here
things.
because it's harder for parties to get funding in Canada than in the United States. So lobbying actually does play a
Yes,
big role here.
yeah, yeah. Well, in the United States, it's pretty easy to get money, but but
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
both countries have certain regulations that do control how that money can trickle down to you.
and gets
Like
distributed. Yeah,
we even have things like whatever you want to have a dinner with the prime minister while what's that gala or whatever
yeah.
they
Them.
all pay.
Jeez, yeah.
I
I
don't
keep
know,
thinking of that
forget what
stupid
it's called, but
Met Gala that the celebrities
no,
go
yeah,
to.
it's not that, but it's a version of something like that in the
But
sense
for
of
politicians, yeah.
yeah, exactly. You can pay money to have a plate of food and sit down
Yeah, and then talk
with
about your business and how you might.
exactly,
Yeah,
right? So, money obviously plays a big part of it. But you also have the kind of how I mentioned, like the soft power of it, where you may not have it that I'm funding a political campaign based off of my business and they're going to promote my ideology. But you also might have where we see interest groups and lobbyist groups that run campaign ads or not even campaign ads, just ads based around the
ads. Yeah,
government, right?
yeah,
And they're trying to spin a certain narrative, and if you're watching that ad as a whatever you're watching TV or watching the news or surfing the internet, um, those those ads that are kind of promoting a certain narrative,
yeah.
uh, that's another way that those lobbyist groups kind of promote their ideology, right?
And their message.
The
Yeah,
the teachers union who wants whatever better pay for teachers may have a commercial on the radio
yeah.
that's talking about the government wants to
Mothers
cut
against drunk
the
driving.
classes.
Here.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. You see it all the time with Mad, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. That's a great example, right?
yeah.
Um, they're not talking to, especially in a democracy, and I guess that's really where it always really comes into play. But in a democracy, because we as individuals do have some decision making power,
Yeah.
if you can convince the voters to get behind a cause, you can have the pressure be put on government so
Instead
that
of, yeah.
instead of like actually directly going to government and saying, "Hey, I want you to do this," you could just say, "Hey, I'm going to go to your constituents and tell them they should
Yeah,
call
and
you up and do this,"
yeah,
right?
if you want them to vote for you again, you're going to have to work along the lines of our interests because
Mhm.
now we've swayed
Yeah.
the public to it as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they're almost the politicians that don't actually run for office, right? They do the exact same kind of things where I'm trying to convince you of one thing or another,
Yeah.
um, in order to kind of control the outcomes, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
uh, sorry, were you going to say something else
No,
or
no, no.
okay? Well, so I think kind of going off of that, right? We've talked about things with lobbying, and how those things do, like everything, have pros and cons, but they can potentially go off the rails, and that where kind of
I was
comes
just
into play with checks and balances, right?
correct, especially when you get one of the bad ones.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
If it's trying to manipulate the system for nefarious reasons, yeah.
Yeah. And that's, we see where we have issues with checks and balances in certain parts of our system.
Hmm. Yes. like, so
I'll let you.
obviously, in terms of the lobbying stuff, you had talked about this. There's different rules and regulations that go into how much money or how people like do you have to publicize your lobbying interests or your campaign
Interactions or funding or yeah,
yeah, campaign funding and donations and all that kind of
that's
stuff.
it.
So
Donations.
there's
Yeah,
those types of checks and balances. But I think it kind of bringing it back slightly to the democratic system, um, looking at those checks and balances that are kind of whatever, in the case of Canada and the United States, built into our constitution, right?
yeah.
So, right then and there, the Constitution is a checks and balance system. So
It's
it's
part
it's
of yeah. It's
yeah, it's a document that lays out some kind of real basic ground rules of this is what society that of
yeah.
Canada should look
Supposedly
like.
living tree where you can add and adjust to it as you need to.
In Canada's case, yes, it's a living
Yes.
tree
Yeah.
document. The United States would say otherwise.
No, theirs is a
Um,
dead tree. Yeah.
yeah,
It's
the tree is
a Lincoln
what
log,
it
actually.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually just a rock.
Yeah.
It's not a tree. It's just a stone tablet. Um, where there's no backspace.
Yeah. We,
But yeah, so you have that's one form of checks and balance. So I
we
don't
have
know
like
if we want to
this.
kind of go off of that, right? The idea of a constitution. In Canada, you had mentioned we have a living tree document, is what we kind of call it. Um,
Able to
it's that idea
re-amend it
that it
and
can constantly grow in terms of
what
adding.
what it
We
consists
don't
of.
really take
Yeah.
away. I don't know. Can you think of an example if we've ever taken something away?
Yeah, nothing off the top of my head where we've
Yeah,
taken anything because ours is still relatively new too, but
for
nothing
sure.
off the top of my head.
Yeah, so it's more
We
about
definitely
adding
added
things.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
As
so
in the
it's
tree because it's branching out more.
yeah, right? So as things change, right? We in our constitution, we can tweak things, right? Things like whatever, the internet
Yeah.
wasn't existing at the time that our constitution, like many constitutions of the world. So you can adjust things accordingly, right?
And then you
You
can
also have the
argue.
flips. Nope,
Oh,
sorry. Yeah.
sorry. Oh no. No, I was gonna say actually, I was gonna say you could argue that like the U.S. their constitutions maybe not as a form of checks and
Malleable.
balances the way it used to be. Yes, but they do have a little bit more level of like government layers of governance where you have Congress, Senate, and the executive branch,
Yeah.
which
Yep.
is it's almost a detrimental form of checks and balances to them sometimes because the fluidity of how those positions change and how often they change
Hmm.
really makes it hard for people to come to like or sorry shouldn't make it hard for people to come to decisions. It makes it hard for those branches to execute decisions
Correct. Yeah. I think that
because
goes right back to your point about individualism, right?
yes, yeah,
When
and
you
if you
have
have
more and
like
more people trying to make that decision and coming to the same agreement,
agreement, yeah,
how
but
is that going to be successful, or is there going to be some pushback on a
where you
different
get
decision?
the effect of the million different voices have a million different opinions and how do
Yeah.
they all get represented
Yeah.
without getting tied up in the situation like yeah where the United States has been trying to tackle healthcare for 2 decades now and they still can't come to a decision on it and they
Yeah.
even had a president who was willing to enact it and tried to but
Well, yeah, and then it kind of again these all these things kind of compound and lump together, but then it comes into the politics side of it where it's like, okay, we're willing to do this, but in order to do that, you have to tweak this thing,
yeah
or you have to add this clause, or
yeah and
something like
that's where
that, and
that's
you in
where
order to
lobbyists come
play
in yeah
ball,
yeah
right? You you kind of bend what you maybe originally believed in order to get something done.
so correct because you know it's I've well it's going to be sat on decision or it's like oh I only have these two options anyways so I'm just going to go with one that I'm a little less ticked off with
Yeah. Yeah.
or it seems a little less dumb out of the two. Like you
Yeah,
end up
or
just
there's
going with the
something in
lesser
here
of
that
two
benefits
evils.
me in
Yeah,
particular or my
yes. And in
constituents
that
or
case, yes, too, as well, because we did mention that, right? Where individualism kind of plays back into it, where you have people that don't understand the full mechanics of how the system works from start to finish.
Mhm.
And then you have not just lobbyists, but in a way too, like you can also argue that like news corporations lobby in their own way as well,
Yeah,
because certain networks will spin certain narratives to get people to vote one way or the other, and
definitely.
they're all supported by the state. So it's one of those things where, yeah, your checks and balances are only as good. They're only going to work if you kind of adjust them to the nature of the way, not just the system is, but how the system's being driven.
Yeah, I think it's that constant reevaluation almost of are our checks and balance like we want checks and balances, right? We don't want government to just run free with whatever they want to do because us as individuals who at the end of the day are only giving people the right to for representation, right? To
Yeah,
represent us in government. After we've given them that right to represent us, we kind of lose our right to make a decision. So we have to have still something in society that says, "Hey, us as constituents, us as citizens of this country, how do we still make sure that you're kind of following a general guideline of what we think is appropriate as a society?" So we're creating these checks and balances, but then are these checks and balances sometimes too heavy or too many layers
yeah,
that they are kind of holding back progress? Or are there other things like, let's say in Canada, we have a Senate that's technically a part of the checks and balance system, but our Senate really just
doesn't.
passes whatever comes through because they're
Yeah,
not elected, right?
correct.
So
Yeah,
they have, unless they feel like something is really against the Constitution, let's say, um, in Canada, they pretty much are saying yes to anything that kind of goes through the House of
yeah. That
Commons, the
the
Parliament.
parliament will put through to them. Yeah,
Yeah. Right. So there's so many different layers to it, right? We had talked about already the idea of how the legislative and the executive branches of government are broken down. That affects how checks and balances work. So no matter where you live, if you live in a democracy, you'll be able to see that there are so many different layers to it that it's not simply that, okay, my president or my prime minister wants this to be law, then okay, we're going to go down that road, right? There's
yeah,
tons of different things, both positive and negative, right?
yeah.
Um, yeah, sorry, I don't know if you were about to say something there.
Oh no, 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 no.
Okay.
Just looking.
Um, yeah, but so we actually already kind of talked about the Constitution and how that really is that big document that everything should be based upon. But of course, most constitutions, if they are a, a well written constitution, in my opinion, I would say they should be as basic and as simplistic as possible,
Possible.
right?
Yeah,
Because that's where the moment you start to get, and this is kind of the same thing with the checks and balances, the more that you try to control a small aspect of something rather than the idea of, like, for instance, the right to life, right? Like the right to that you're not going to murder someone, right?
yeah,
That's a pretty basic overarching, it's good enough, right?
yeah.
But
The
then you
idea
have
of
some things like the United States have with like gun reform, where you have the Second Amendment, right? That's a very specific thing, right? The right
the
to bear
well, it's not
arms.
just a specifically general amendment where it's like, okay, but what do you mean by the right to bear arms?
Yeah, that's a great point. Even in taking such a specific thing like how do we control guns, you have it's so vague that, like,
Yeah.
well, what
To
does that
what
really mean?
extent? Yeah.
Yeah, right? Like, should anyone control guns? I mean, if everyone can control guns, how should they be able to control
Yeah.
guns? Should there be any
Exactly.
kind
Yeah.
of checks and balances within that? So there is so many layers to all these things. And that's what eventually you see where you can have opinions that are happening today in our societies that may even be the leaders of our nations, that some things get through and are passed with ease, and then there's others where they're constantly held up. And you had mentioned like healthcare is one of those things, right? A
Yeah.
lot of people believe that universal healthcare would be a great thing for society. um
if it could be
But it's
implemented.
how
Yeah,
does that universal healthcare work? And or actually, I guess the better point is most of us believe that healthcare should be provided or it should be accessible to people.
yeah,
But
to the
how do we
general
go
public.
about
Yeah,
that is
and how do
is
we get
is
it?
the
Yeah,
the difference, right? And so those checks and balances of certain things sometimes get in the way of what the real discussion is, and along with politics and everything else,
yeah.
money,
Just like we're
lobbying,
talking about how the over politicizing of certain subjects stray people away from
100%.
the actual purpose
Yeah.
of what it was being discussed for in the first place.
Yeah, and because with a democracy, right, we're wanting, right, our overarching goal is to have the majority of us agree to something, right?
Yeah,
Um, because that's how we know it's representative of what our belief system is, right?
correct.
But even with that being said,
On that note,
uh,
yeah.
yeah, on that note, um,
I was just thinking that too. It's
yeah,
like,
we with democracies, because we have this rule of the majority, right? The majority rules, obviously. Um, we have seen throughout history, and it may be in your own countries. Uh, you can make the argument that it even happens in Canada and stuff like that. But this idea that the rule of majority turns to the tyranny of majority, right? So it's the fact that if a majority rules, and we've joked about this all the time, if you look at your friend group, right? Let's say there's, I don't know, five of us going out for dinner, and uh, we all want to go for sushi, but we have a member, like a friend in the group, who is, uh,
shellfish
yeah,
allergic.
allergic to shellfish. Well, if let's say even three of us, three out of the five of us, it doesn't even have to be like a massive majority, but
Yeah,
um, uh,
still the majority.
yeah, the majority in that
Yeah,
sense would say, okay, we're going for sushi. Well, obviously, if you're that person who is allergic to shellfish
yeah. You
or
now
whatever,
cannot
or just,
participate. Yeah,
yeah, you're basically just sitting there for at dinner or lunch
yeah,
and
or
hoping that
just
no
yeah.
contact of anything is
And
getting near
hopefully
you,
the fortune
right?
cookies have been wrapped in plastic the whole
Yeah, or something
time.
like that.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think there's no
No,
fortune cookies in sushi.
no, no, no. I should try though. Stop me from
That's a
ordering
full out
dessert.
Chinese thing,
Yeah,
isn't it? Isn't it only Chinese food that has fortune cookies? It only also
yeah.
probably in North America, because I don't believe that it's
There's a
actually
bunch
invented
of
in
in
China.
Brampton. They have like it's like West Indian slash Chinese like food places.
Oh,
So
okay.
you get like a roti and a fortune cookie in the same place. It's kind of weird.
There
Yeah,
you go. Yeah, so there's versions of
yeah,
it, but nevertheless,
yeah.
we're getting sidetracked
Sorry.
there. No, it's my fault for
Yeah,
using
in
my
case people
analogy.
didn't know, there you go.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so yeah, using kind of getting away slightly from my analogy, it's that idea that we hold so deeply with democracies that if
Yeah,
the
the way they're
majority of us
enshrined.
agree with it, then it's right. So there's two issues I think that we want to point out in particular with that.
Yes.
One,
Yeah.
we just kind of talked about that idea of like, well, okay, if the majority of us choose something and it's
You're still
detrimental to
neglecting
someone
the
else,
needs of the minority.
yeah, the need, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
The needs of the minority is going to be completely neglected. And then kind of going back to what we originally were like, or not even originally, but throughout this entire episode, we've talked about in that concept of education and all that aspects, is that if you can convince the majority of people to believe something, which that's the job of a politician, let's be honest here,
Yeah.
is to convince you that something is right or something else is wrong. Um, you could be convinced that something is right to do it this way, and therefore you vote for it and it continues down that path, even
Yeah.
though there could be a million different issues with
Different
that,
issues. Yeah.
right?
And it's, it's a weird example, but I don't
Hmm.
know why it just came to me. But if you've ever read, even actually, it's in the movie too, World War Z, where Israel has a rule where if they're in a crisis, they form a committee of 10 people. And if 9 people come to the same conclusion, it is the obligation of the 10th person to disagree, even if they don't,
Yeah, there
because
you
then
go.
there's something that's being missed.
Mhm.
If everybody's agreeing on something, then there's something that's being missed.
Yes. Yeah,
And I
we
think
don't
that's
have
the
proper representation there.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's the principle to take away from the majority, how the majority rules can become dangerous. Because if you're
Yeah.
constantly just going with the same stuff over and over, which might not be terrible, especially like if you could reach
No.
perfection, and yes, you would want to keep conservative at that point, but
Yeah. Yeah.
but at the same time, even perfect can become stagnant, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's one of those things that
Because it's that
you
same
kind of almost
mentality, right?
need to be addressing all angles of it, even though you're going to go with a general sense of what the majority is wishing for. You kind of have to keep everything on a, like on the table in a weird way.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point because it's with democracies we don't question majorities,
Mhm.
right? If a majority of people agree with something, we just say, okay, it is what it is. That's what a
That's
majority of people agree with.
yeah,
But to your point and your example with like the World War Z, what they're trying to do is that you should always question, right? They'd be like, okay, we agree with this, but
yeah.
are we actually right here, or is there something we're
Yeah.
missing? Like you
Well, then
just,
now that I'm thinking about it, because there's a few generals I could think of in history where if the entire command staff, yeah, we should do it. The one guy that usually disagrees is like Napoleon. If Napoleon always loved it, if someone spoke up against his ideas, he'd be like, okay, what do you got to say? Let's take a look on the
yeah,
map again and
didn't,
go back to it. Yeah, what did I miss?
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and I think that that's a such a
yeah,
great point in contrast that I think most of us think that if the majority speaks up about something and you're in the minority, that if you're going to speak up, it's just going to be immediately striked down,
striking
or
down. Yes. Yeah,
um, uh, yeah, right. Like so that you're immediately labeled as wrong, for lack of a better
correct.
word,
Yeah,
right? That aspect is so key to understanding how a democracy
yeah,
functions because we don't always leave room for that debate unless it's simply a situation well actually we do sometimes leave room for that debate but it tends to be just we allow the loudest person in the room,
room, correct.
right? And
And
that's what our politics have kind of
yeah,
if you've ever had no life like sometimes we had at times in university. I'm joking, it wasn't that we had no life, we were just like being ridiculous, but watching things like c-span and where you watch uh
oh yeah, all the dry, yeah,
parliament
yeah,
or
yeah,
the senate or the house of representatives or whatever your country has, um how they debate things.
yeah. It's
it
kind of
is
sad. Yeah.
it is very sad. If you've ever watched it, we wouldn't have to actually even do this episode. You would realize how much of a ridiculousness our democratic systems are
Although if you try
because
to watch a whole 60 minutes of C-SPAN, you might become a suicide statistic.
yeah.
So there's that as
Oh
well.
no. Yeah.
I would like
Yeah.
to hope we're a little less dull than C-SPAN.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Give
We're
it
like
time.
B-SPAN.
Yeah. Oh man. But yeah, it's crazy how the only times, yeah, that you allow the debate to truly happen is you have to make it as much of a performance as possible for it to be even heard
yeah.
because otherwise if it's in the minority it's ignored, right?
And I think to your
Yeah,
oh
yeah,
sorry.
sorry.
No, go ahead, finish that. My apologies.
No, no, go for it.
Well, no, I think to your point is that we've seen that affect politics in the last oh geez, how my brain I guess was how long ago was 2016? 6 years? Like the rise of Donald Trump is
Yeah,
like it's to your point, it's the loudest person in the room.
yeah,
And it's like how populism can get out of control and how the majority can become clouded.
yeah. And I think it works both ways, right?
Oh,
Because even prior
100%
to
works.
that, it was
100% works both
Obama,
ways. The Obama
right?
fever too. It's like, Obama's going to
Yeah,
change it. I'm like, they're still blowing up schools with drones. So like, I don't know what you
yeah.
expected
What?
to change.
Yeah.
Like,
What did you think? Yeah,
Tupac warned us we weren't ready to see a black president.
yeah, yeah. And it wasn't the hologram.
yeah, it should have been him.
Yeah. Yeah, but it is it's so true, right? I'm glad you brought that up. That idea of the rise of populism, um, and how again it comes back to that stuff that we talked about earlier with politics, and that
we
it's
actually touched on it
politicians that
a
are
lot
running.
earlier that yeah, like even here in Canada, where
Mhm.
JT came out in his first election campaign with the
JT.
platform of running legalized pot, and yeah, highest youth voter turnout in history,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
that is
Which
just populism working.
which I hate to say this, but if you haven't realized already, whether cannabis is legal or not really has a very small portion to play in how we run societies and
Societies,
government
correct?
and all
Yeah,
this stuff, right? It
especially
really,
here. Yeah,
yeah.
or
Like
even before
obviously,
cannabis was legalized in Canada, it was very hard. Like it was not very. It wasn't prosecuted the way it was in the states. Let's put it
yeah,
that
it's
way.
definitely not prosecuted
Yeah,
the same way
cops
as
didn't go
states
out
or
looking for it.
yeah, or other parts, other countries in the world. Um,
Yeah,
but like really, unless you're kind of looking at it from a justice perspective and things like that, um, it's a small portion of how our society works, right? Like,
yeah.
yes, obviously, it would be great to get those people out of the prison system because then that's money that we're not spending. Or
But
it's great
it's
to
it wasn't
decriminalize or legalize
the shouldn't have
because
been the forefront issue of the election.
exactly,
We live in a
right?
world with the amount of poverty and climate change, and
Yeah,
yes, there should have been a few more issues that should have been the driving factor of why people were elected.
yeah, for
And
sure, and
not to his detriment, he played his cards perfectly right.
100% smart move. As if
Yeah,
you're a politician out there,
this is where
picking
the onus
things,
comes back on the individual again.
yeah, picking things that are going to allow people to like you is the way to run your platform at the end of the day. And that
Yeah,
we said it right in the beginning of this episode. It's about saying what people want to hear rather than what they need to hear.
yeah,
Um, and I'm not trying to undermine. It, Trudeau had some other policies and stuff like that, but for the most part, that's how he won
and that's
the election.
unfortunately, and for most voting Canadians, that was the only thing that drew their attention.
Correct.
Which
Yeah,
is that's the real tragedy
the real tragedy.
of what
Yeah,
we've been talking about this whole time is the failure of the education system, the promotion of how capitalism has driven the focus of individualism to the point of being narcissist is okay.
yeah, it's profitable.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And like
Yeah.
you said, it doesn't matter what side you're on. It's both sides now. It's if you have that attitude, it doesn't matter if you're left or right. That's where your votes are going to gravitate towards.
Yeah. And
And
you
it's not the
even
right
talked about
kind of
that idea of
extreme. Yeah.
yeah, you'd even talked about earlier that idea of being able to critically think, right? And
Yes.
part of critically thinking is not going with your gut instinct always, right?
Always. It's
Um
stopping before you act
yeah,
upon it.
it
Yes.
doesn't mean that you might still come to
Yeah,
that
it
same
still could be
conclusion.
100% right, but you want to just check everything first. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
we
Yeah,
could
it
all learn
is.
from NASA.
Yeah, there you
Or I
go,
shouldn't
right?
say NASA, but NASA employees.
Yeah. What, doing them double checking their math and stuff like that, or
Yeah, the
what?
guys that keep the satellites floating.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. The NASA.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everybody owes those guys a beer.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go, right? Um,
Yelling at my GPS. Wait, I can't read a map anymore. Like,
yeah, yeah.
I
Why am
used
I
to.
so dumb? Yeah.
Then you nerds made it too easy for me.
Yeah. Yep. Um, and yeah, and it is that. It's that aspect of as society gets easier, we put less emphasis on learning for ourselves, and so it makes it easier when a charismatic figure or someone who says what we want to hear allows that like process to continue, right?
Yeah.
um and it really parallels like that rise of populism and that idea of the tyranny of the majority do go hand in hand, right? It
Mhm.
You can make an argument like there's a real reason why after for some like a good chunk of the world as well as American citizens who thought Obama was the greatest thing to ever come out of
Yeah.
politics, uh, to then have Donald Trump be your president, right? That is the clear representation of
Yeah.
how people were ignored in that those his two terms in office or felt like they were being
Ignored.
ignored.
Correct. Yeah. And it was that
That
much of the population that went
yeah,
into that far of an extreme.
yes.
Because
Yeah.
most of the people that voted for Trump weren't what you would consider a Trump supporter.
No, yeah,
Yeah.
or yeah,
Like,
yeah,
not the "Make
specifically the
America Great
stereotype.
Again" wearing the
Yeah,
T-shirt around the house or out of it.
yeah,
Like
yeah. Or if you did that, you still wouldn't have been in terms of your political ideology. Maybe you don't fit the mold of the radical sides of Donald Trump.
Trump,
Maybe you're
correct.
like, okay, I believe, yeah, in tax cuts, or I believe in whatever, right? X, Y, and Z. You can kind of go down that rabbit hole yourselves.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's all a great point. Like, and like, to give almost a little bit of like a Canadian context, not necessarily for the rise of populism, but you could make the same argument. Um, in our country, we're always talking about like creating pipelines and stuff like that for the oil industry. Um, Justin Trudeau has a huge, I don't know what the word I want to say is, but but he tries to present himself as a very environmentally friendly type of person, cares about global warming and all that kind of stuff. But then also wants to create pipelines
Yeah.
for our to get our oil, which obviously I'm not ignoring the economic benefits that come from that.
But
But
you'd think,
to
yeah, at this point, there's gotta be another way.
yeah, well, in particular, I think that it's important to look at, like, when it goes back to that tyranny of the majority type of situation, right?
Yeah.
If you're not looking at, for instance, let's say indigenous, um, uh, what's it called? Not values, like their what they want. What's the word? I'm blanking on words right now.
Interests?
Yeah, yes, thank you. Sure. Like, if you're not looking at their interests, even though they may be considered a minority, right? If you have to take a pipeline and put it
Mhm.
right through, um, like treaty territories or
Well, and
stuff
that's the
like that,
thing, and some tribes might be advocating for it because 'cause they're gonna benefit it because it's not going through their land.
sure,
And
yeah, right,
that
yeah,
they'll be lobbying
little
the government,
politics within
"Hey,
that,
yeah,
yeah,
you owe us this pipeline, man."
yeah, right. The politics on on
Yeah.
all sides of it, right?
Yep. It
Um,
gets messy.
But yeah, right? It's any of those types of things where you're like, okay, at the end of the day, is this still going to benefit everyone, or is there something holding us back, right?
Yeah.
And that rise of populism is that the the result of the blinders of the tyranny of the
Correct.
majority,
And
right?
to go way back, because this all started with you asking me a question if democracy serves its
Yeah.
purpose. And now that we've looked at all of this stuff, you can't really say that it does because it's not accurate. We live in systems that, for the love of, we just had this giant protest that started 4,000 miles away one end of the country and parked out front of our capital city for a month. And it's like, if you can't tell that there's dissent, and this is supposed to be after 3 years of having the same government elected. So it goes to show you that, yes, the way we have our democracy structure right now doesn't leave a lot of room for even half of the other half, like of the majority to be, because really, and like you said, like the way our system structured here in Canada is that the majority is 51%. At the end of the day, that's how our
Hmm.
elections go down to. Like, it can literally come down to the 1%, like 49 and 51% split, and the 51% is taking governance.
Well, it's not even that; it's 50% plus one.
Plus, yeah,
Like, because it's not
yeah,
even like like a full
yeah,
percent. It's just like
percentage,
one
yeah.
extra seat.
Hmm.
um,
Yeah, and it literally, yeah, it comes down to one seat. It could come down to one seat. So you can literally have the country divided and ruled by that one seat divide.
mhm,
And it's
yeah.
just, you're never going to have fair representation in that sense. And I think that's where we as a society have kind of failed in the last maybe 100 years or so, and especially now, where it's, well, democracy is a great idea, but democracy has been around for 4 and 5 centuries now. It's not like the Roundheads in England, that was in the 1600s. That's, we've had democracy functioning.
Well, you could go all the way back to the Greeks,
Magna
right?
Carta, yeah.
Like,
But like, arguably, it started with Cromwell because that's where
modern
the Parliament,
democracies, yes, for
yeah.
sure.
Which
Yep.
still, that's the 16th century, and not
Yeah.
much has changed in terms of the constitutional ones or the presidential ones. We're still basically using all the same rules that were made for a world that has not existed in several centuries.
Hmm.
And it's, yeah. So democracy is a great idea, but is it time for democracy to, you know? go through puberty, maybe, probably. Maybe it's time
Yeah,
for it to grow a beard, take on a different, grow into what it's supposed to be. And we might have to call it something else by then.
yeah. What a funny way to describe that. But yeah, no, it's a great point, right? Because at the end of the day, if democracies are about giving representation, right, giving people a voice, so that you're not abused by the government, right,
Yeah,
or the whatever power is in charge.
in charge, yeah.
If that were to be true, we would really have to question why there is the amount of poverty that we have in our world, why there are people that go hungry,
The wealth gap in
why,
general, even now, is just between the
yeah,
middle
yeah,
class and yeah,
yeah, right, why, well, we had already talked about it, right, the idea that minority groups um are not engaged with, but rather shunned, right? I don't
correct.
think,
Yeah.
like, personally,
And you don't even have
I
to go as far as minority groups. You just even minority like opinions come out, and it's just
yeah, sorry,
instantly
that's what
shut
I meant.
down.
I
Yeah,
appreciate you clarifying that. That's what I meant by minority groups. I don't mean like identity politics. I mean
yeah, I got you. Yeah,
a
yeah, yeah.
minority opinion.
Yeah.
Uh,
A fringe opinion.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Whatever that may be, right? If you
Yeah, we could be overlooking the
X Y
answer
Z,
to
yeah,
climate change by ignoring some of these fringe ideas.
yeah,
Who knows?
because
Like this.
and again, it's exactly like we said just previously. Um, it's not that after the discussion you have to agree with that minority view.
No,
It's
but it's
that
the
if the conversation is not being had,
and how do you
then
know?
yeah, right. You had
Yeah,
mentioned the whole freedom convoy. I'm not. I don't agree with most of the stuff that convoy believed in. However, I think the from a democratic standpoint, the issue I have with the way that that was dealt with is that the engagement and the conversation on both sides, right? Because I don't think that the Freedom Convoy was willing to have a conversation. No different than I don't think that the government was willing to have any kind of conversation. Um, the lack of conversation and the lack of educating each other on how we are feeling and how what we believe and why we believe it, um, is real detrimental to the aspect of how our democracy is going to function, right? Because again, it comes back to that idea of education that you had
yeah,
touched upon, that I had touched upon. If if we all understand how our kind of world works, how our societies and systems work, uh, we're likely to come to a very similar conclusion. Or even if it's something that we may not really want for ourselves, we can see how the value of it is for the
yeah.
society as a whole.
Well, and I think yeah, like to your point, like it comes to the critical thinking and the the example I just used, where you don't have to apply that to people. If you have 10 different opinions presented to you and you agree with all 10 of them, maybe you have to, it's your obligation to disagree with one of them in that sense. Do you know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because
And have
that's,
that debate.
yes, because there's no absolute truths. Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
I mean, I think there's some absolute truth.
Yes, yes. Scientifically, yes. No, 100%. Yes.
Uh,
But I mean, in
I
terms
mean,
of the human
what can I
condition.
say?
Yeah.
I'm not going to agree with you on
Yeah.
that.
No, the sun is definitely the specific Kelvin. I am not contesting that. I didn't even
Yeah.
want to roast a marshmallow near that
Yeah.
thing.
Nevertheless, right?
Yeah.
It's clear to see, as you've just said, right? There are a lot of great things that have come out of democracies, right? We've talked about like the idea of human rights, this
We've
idea
created
of
the modern
freedom of
world with it.
choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's been pretty good.
Yeah, and that idea that because you have that right to do those things, you are protected, right? You're not going to just be abused
Yeah.
by government.
And
But what has come out of those things, like the idea of individualism, as great and as powerful as of a idea that is, it's very much so in direct contrast and in opposition, you can even argue, to what a democracy is about.
yeah,
Because at the end of the day, a democracy has to run on the idea of a majority rule, right? There
correct.
is no
Yeah.
other way that democracies can
Yeah.
function. But
Yeah.
there are issues with the idea of how we create majorities. what that majority represents.
Sense.
And
Yeah.
if we can even create a majority, I think you're seeing more and more in today's societies.
Fissure and fracturing and, yeah,
Yes, right?
different
The
groups and opinions.
politicization
Yeah.
of every single thing makes it so that you can't even agree with your own party at times, right? Like, or
Yeah.
your own ideologies, because there is so many just individualists, right? Like, not to
Oh, yeah.
again go down that
Well,
rabbit hole, but
no,
like
exactly.
the
But actually, I
leftism
just
of,
thought of a good analogy. If anyone's going to take anything away from this today, is that you kind of got to look at democracy like an old car or like your first car. It was great to you. It's done great things for you, but at some point, it's going to need a tune up and an upgrade. And it can continue to do great things for you, but it's going to need a tune up and an upgrade
yeah,
for it
yeah,
to continue serving you at the best possible, like, maximum performance.
yeah, to kind of to further that, to assume that the vehicle that is democracy is still running perfectly
Yes.
today
Yeah.
as it did when we
Yeah.
first.
We definitely are a few thousand kilometers over our last oil change. I would definitely,
Yeah, yeah,
we need to start looking at the lights on the dashboard as a society.
yeah, remove the blinders and see, why do some
Yeah.
things about our democracies function well, and
Yeah.
why do some of those things not function well,
Yeah. I
right?
think it's time for us as a civilization to address the check engine light on our democracies.
That's a great point, and I think that that's a great place for us to leave it.
Now I'm
I
worried
hope you
about
guys.
my car. I was like, I
Yeah,
gotta go
yeah,
check my car,
yeah.
actually.
On that note, right? Yeah, yeah. But nevertheless, right? Some great things that have come out of democracies. Some things that we need to work on, and hopefully, as a
Definite room for
society,
improvement. Yeah.
yeah, along with everything that we're kind of going through on this journey for Powerview for this series, um, it's that reevaluation, right? It's not the like let's burn it all to the ground type of situation.
Exactly. It's how
It's
can we
that
make it better?
no matter what in life, you should always be reevaluating your own life, how your the society works, how your systems of government work, right? And question why certain things happen the way that they do, and if there was another way for those things to happen, right? But on that note, as always, I'm Braden, he's Jordan. We are the Realist Idealists, and this is Power.